Well, hello, everybody. This is Rabbi Dan Levin, and this is Essential Questions. In the Pirkei Avot, Rabbi Akiva notes something obvious and extraordinary. Chaviv Adam shenivra b'tzelem. How beloved is humanity to be created in God's image. But how much more beloved is humanity that humanity was made aware of being created in God's image. The one word, noda'at, to be made aware, is what is truly miraculous about humankind. It's not simply that we exist, but that we can think about what our existence means. We appreciate the idea that we do not exist simply for the sake of existing, but that we can discover and discern a higher meaning to our existence, a purpose to our existence. The awareness of our relationship to the author of the universe that embedded within us a spark of energy, divine energy, that gives us the capacity to think, to feel, to love, ought to inspire some measure of gratitude. That gratitude should inspire some sense of accountability or duty. To be blessed with such extraordinary gifts, a world so gloriously beautiful that sustains the amazing diversity of life, and that we have the privilege of sharing a few years of life in it, how should we use that time? How should we use our relative power? How and what should we be in the world? Abraham Joshua Heschel famously wrote, "Amidst the meditation of the mountains, the humility of flowers, wiser than all alphabets, clouds that die constantly for the sake of his glory, we are hating, hunting, hurting." Suddenly we feel ashamed of our clashes and complaints in the face of the tacit glory of nature. It is so embarrassing to live. How strange we are in the world and how presumptuous our doings. Only one response can maintain us: gratefulness for witnessing the wonder, for the gift of our unearned right to serve, to adore, to fulfill. It is gratefulness which makes the soul great. But to make our souls great, we cannot simply stop with gratitude. We have to think about duty and responsibility. As Jews, we live in covenant with the Creator, the Eternal, and that impresses upon us responsibilities and duties for how to use the gift of life. Kedoshim tiyu, you shall be holy, teaches chapter 19 in the book of Leviticus. But how do we live a life of transcendence? What do we owe ourselves, our families, our loved ones, our communities, our people, our nation, or nations, the human family, our world? Our guest today, Rabbi Dr. Michael Marmur, recently wrote in his new book, Living the Letters, how to understand being Jewish. Is it a religion, a civilization, a community of memory, an ethnic group, an ethical imperative, an accident of birth, a joy, a blight? I see it, he writes, as an alphabet, building blocks of meaning which prompt the formation of vocabularies and modes of discourse. For me, it is an instrument of perception, a way of seeing. It does not follow from this that Jews pronounce the same words or see the same realities as each other. Indeed, there has never been a time in which the question of what being Jewish implies and demands has been the subject to such wide and often contradictory interpretations. And so to answer the question of what it's all about, today we are blessed to have Michael with us. Born and raised in England, Michael earned his BA degree in modern history from the University of Oxford, and then made Aliyah in 1984. After his army service, he earned his master's from Hebrew University in ancient Jewish history, and then his rabbinic ordination from the Hebrew Union College, later returning to Hebrew University where he earned his PhD in modern Jewish thought. After serving 6 years at the Leo Beck Education Center in Haifa, he led the Jerusalem, now the Toby campus of the Hebrew Union College as dean, and then later served as HUC's provost from 2009 to 2018. He has also served as the chair of Rabbis for Human Rights and recently published Living the Letters, an alphabet of emerging Jewish thought. Michael, thank you so much for coming all the way across the ocean and to be with us today.
It is a great pleasure to be with you. And I think after that fantastic introduction, I have to go lie down and just reflect on all the things that you've said. But it is really wonderful to be with you.
Well, jet lag will do that to you. So, Michael, tell us a little bit about your background. Growing up in England, the son of a rabbi who himself had an extraordinary journey. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing and what were the influences that inspired you.
Well, as you say, and as my accent will make abundantly self-evident, I was born and raised in England, but it's only the first third of what's so far been my lifespan was spent there. I've spent over 40 years in Israel. My parents had come to Britain just a few years before I was born. They're both Polish born and had each made their way through rather dramatic circumstances to Sweden after the war. And from Sweden, my father decided to be part of the first cohort of students at the Leo Beck College, which is a Reform rabbinical seminary that took shape in Britain in the 1950s. So they came there, and I and my two sisters were born in Britain in the subsequent years. My parents, if you ever asked my father, my late father, Rabbi Dov Marmur, where he was from, his answer would always be elsewhere, because the main, I would say, experience, the main ethos of the home they created, it was very secure and very loving, but it was always kind of clear that we don't quite come from here. My dad once said, after he was in England, he went on to become a rabbi in Toronto at the Holy Blossom Temple, and he once gave a speech in which he said, when I was in Poland, everyone called me a Jew, and when I was in Sweden, everyone called me a Pole. And then I came to England, everyone called me a Swede, and I finally come to Canada so that I will fulfill a life's ambition and people will think of me as an Englishman. At which point a Scottish guy in the audience said, "It's a shame you have such low ambitions." So the idea is I grew up as an all-English kid, cricket, soccer, the whole thing. But the family in which I grew up was kind of deracinated intellectual European Jews, and that was the vibe. My father's teacher, Ignaz Maybaum, had himself been a student of Franz Rosenzweig. This was Franz Rosenzweig, one of the great figures of modern German Jewish thought, and so it was a kind of direct line to a certain European tradition of Rosenzweig and Martin Buber and other such names, and this was the sort of milieu which my father, whose own parents had been completely secularized. His childhood recollection is being sent out to buy the bacon from their kind of slum in Gothenburg in southern Sweden. So he and my mother self-started a Jewish life, imparted it very much to us, and we're carrying it on in our own ways. So I would say I was privileged to be exposed to some very fine aspects of the British educational system, for which I am very grateful. But it was also, back home, it was a somewhat different vibe.
I can resonate a little bit to that because I was raised in a home that was very deeply Jewish and was also a kitchen where we made pepperoni pizza, and we didn't see any division between those two things. And in my own sort of journey exploring Jewish thought, it was Buber and Rosenzweig that spoke to me the most, and we can talk about that in a moment. But Jewish thought wasn't your initial studies, it was history. So what was it about history that pulled you to Oxford and to your studies initially?
Yeah, I mean, I had to choose a topic. I do just want to say, in case my 90-year-old mother is listening, we didn't do the pepperoni pizza. I do want to make that clear. It's okay, Mom, I haven't.
And my mom hopefully will be listening, and there's no apologies for the pepperonis that we enjoyed in our household.
Okay. Well, I'm pleased we've cleared that up for our mothers. Well, I was no good at sciences or math or anything like that. I was either going to study English or history. I found the fact that history bore a relation to something that had actually happened. It's sometimes a tenuous relation, but a relation nonetheless. I found that to be particularly fascinating. And I would say that my interest in things historical has not waned. One of the chapters in my book relates to the historicity of Judaism. You know, for some people, they have a vision of Judaism as if, like the Torah, it kind of falls one day out of the sky and lands on your head. But neither Judaism, as a multi-millennial civilization, nor indeed the Torah, do come from nowhere. They come out of a certain set of historical circumstances. And I've never found diving into the history of stuff reduces that stuff, but actually enriches and deepens it. So I was fascinated by history. I had the opportunity to study with some very fine teachers and learnt, I think, a certain kind of method of how you go about researching and thinking about big issues.
So then, what was it that inspired you following your university experience to make Aliyah?
I was excited. I and my then girlfriend, now wife of many years, Sarah Bernstein, I think we were both animated by the possibility of being part of a story, which was still a new story. The state is only established in 1948. We're in the first act of a big drama. And the idea of playing a role in that, particularly for me, the notion of promoting a version of liberal Judaism, the same tradition which my father had been so excited by and that I was kind of born into, but translating that into an Israeli reality where, by and large, Reform Judaism, in the first decades of Israel's life, was a somewhat foreign commodity. And so I found the idea, having a mission, having a big job, a big story that you can feel yourself part of is a very highly animating feature of life. And I found that in Israel. I'll say one more thing. For me, it had a lot to do with the Hebrew language. I in many ways, think about myself as having come to live in Hebrew as much as I came to live in Israel. And I was always very into languages in general, but the Hebrew language has always had a particular attraction and draw for me. So there were all sorts of reasons, but I would say largely it was what does somebody in their early 20s, how do they make big life decisions? A mixture of imagination, romantic yearnings, the pull of something big and exciting.
So I think about that, and also what you said about liberal Judaism as an excitement, because it's always so interesting to me that liberal Judaism has had such a difficult time rooting in the state of Israel. So I grew up in a home that, as we talked about, was very committed to its Judaism, if not necessarily kashrut or other elements of traditional ritual practice. And part of what I think pulled me to the rabbinate was all of the ideas about, well, is there a way to understand what God is if it isn't some big bald-bearded fuzzy in the sky that deals out service cards depending on how many times you light Shabbat candles? Or if I don't think that God has a pen, is there another way to understand what it means for God to have written the Torah? And all of those sort of questions of how do I pull together, weave together, synthesize the tradition that was gifted to me as my heritage in the modern world in which I lived, and to feel like in order to have a Judaism where I didn't have to check my mind at the door, that I shouldn't have to make those choices. I should be able to have a Judaism that speaks to the predicament in which I live, and I don't have to surrender the wisdom of either. Mm-hmm. It's interesting to me that in Israel, it's been so difficult to create a reality where you would assume that, like, that would be the most fertile ground in which liberal Judaism could grow. And yet you find amongst Israelis an almost aversion to liberal Judaism. If you call someone a reformie in Israel, it's almost like a slur. Can you explain, in your 40 years of living in Israel and having served in so many different institutions of Reformed Jewish life, what is it about those ideas that speak so much to me and to you and to those of us who live in diaspora, and it just doesn't seem to click in the same way to the Israeli mind?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's been one of the big questions of my life and my career. One thing to point out is that things have changed quite significantly. There are now 50-something congregations affiliating with the Israeli Reform movement. Some of them called congregations are more like places on a map, and some of them are functioning congregations, although they do look and work somewhat differently than what you would imagine in a North American context. We have the person in charge of Israel's Association for Civil Rights is a Reform rabbi. One of Israel's leading progressive members of Knesset is Gilad Kariv, a Reform rabbi. We have a much greater degree of exposure, and it's much more part of the conversation than it was some time ago. Having said that, your analysis, I believe, is correct. It's been very, very difficult for liberal versions of Judaism, Reform Judaism, whichever terminology you use, to break through into the kind of cultural DNA of Israel. One way of thinking about this is that Reform in its way was a response to a Jewish response to modernity, and Zionism was a different, often a competing response to modernity. And the Zionist answer, whether it be in its secular form or its orthodox religious form, played on different aspects of the modern Jewish experience, and often it set up liberal Judaism as the bogeyman, as the thing that we are not. I discovered once a fantastic correspondence from the early years of the 20th century in which David Neumark, who had been a European Zionist at some point and came to Cincinnati and was one of the faculty of HUC in the early years of the 20th century, writes a piece in which he says that Achad Ha'am and all the cultural Zionists, that's one of the streams within the Zionist movement, they're all Reform, they just don't know it. And Achad Ha'am was furious at this and wrote lambasted him in reply and said, well, all those Reform Jews, they can't really be what they claim to be because their theology is so weak. They are actually Zionists, that's to say they're motivated by a national identity. They just don't know it. And it's a classic case of one person pointing to the other and say, I know who you are better than you know yourself. So it is true that somehow a dati lo dati, which means orthodox religious or not religious at all, dichotomy or binary, has lasted in Israel for decades. I think it's also fair to say that many of the governing insights and ideas of Israeli society are gradually dissolving and breaking up, as they must do as the decades pass. And I think there's a good chance that whether or not it's called Reform Judaism, that's just a marketing question. But some of the insights of liberal and progressive Judaism, if we keep on doing our work and we keep on being persistent, I think will be part of a new Israeli identity as it emerges.
So at the beginning of your book, you write that you were introduced or were spending time studying the thought of Eugene Borowitz while in prison. You weren't in prison. You were in the military police guarding the prison, which I'm sure had its own difficulties in your service. But Borowitz was probably the foremost Reformed Jewish liberal thinker of the 20th century. And some people might even say the last of the great Reformed Jewish thinkers until your book came about. There have been a lot of people in the Reform movement that have spent beautiful careers writing about other thinkers without adding their own thought to the conversation. I was excited to read your book because for the first time, I think maybe in 50 years, there's been a work that thought to create a comprehensive thought to advance the argument, but it's pinned and the foundations of your thought come from somewhere. So tell us a little bit about Borowitz. What is covenantal theology, and what was it about that sort of spoke to you, and what was compelling about those ideas?
I'd certainly agree with your characterization that in the North American context for sure, there has been no Reform theologian, Reform thinker as consequential, as influential as Eugene Borowitz. His career was spent on the faculty of the Hebrew Union College, and before that in the area of education for the Reform movement. He was the founding editor of a very important journal called Shema, which brought aspects of Jewish ethics into kind of public discourse in a very interesting and significant way. And he sets out in that book, Renewing the Covenant, and in many other of his works, he sets out the essential kind of the essential issue of the modern Jew, which is that we as modern Jews have staked a lot of our confidence and our belief in a certain optimistic idea of progress and things every day and in every way things getting better. But as he says at the beginning of his book, to some degree modernity has proven to be a betrayer. The Holocaust obviously is the quintessential example of that betrayal, but also the breakdown of communal structures. The fact that it's so hard to keep this project of a modern, relevant Judaism alive. Who's doing well in terms of numbers and support and all the rest of it out in the Jewish world? there are some, I'm pleased to say, some institutions and congregations that are doing well in the liberal camp, but overwhelmingly, who's doing well are folks offering a non-liberal, often a non-modern version of Judaism and Jewish life. Borowitz is quite a rigorous thinker. He rejects all kinds of theological options that are impossible for him, and he does indeed promote this image, an ancient biblical image of the covenant, as trying to answer the question, why am I committed to do the things that I do? And I, as you point out, open my book in a somewhat provocative way by saying I was in jail when I wrote this book. I was in jail, but I was there as part of the jailing staff as a military policeman in the 1990s in Israel, one of the moments when there were a lot of Palestinians being brought into those prisons. And I found the experience of reading Borowitz's book, which is very much a diaspora book, okay, asking what does it mean to be commanded? What is a theology of Jewish duty in what he calls a post-liberal setting? I found that reading that book and asking those questions in uniform, in a jail where the sovereign use of power, sometimes appropriate, sometimes disproportionate, where the sovereign use of power is what defines one's identity almost as a member of a Jewish state in this new political reality. If we haven't had for 2,000 years, it struck me that his questions, what does it mean to be commanded as a liberal Jew, have to look different in a new context. Borowitz was I don't know whether he was an anti-Zionist. He wouldn't have answered to that definition perhaps, but he was not a red-hot Zionist. He didn't come to Israel, he didn't take Israel particularly seriously. It was not central to his theology, but it was to mine. And so I wanted to, yes, be part of a new generation of emerging Reform thought, and I wanted to ask his questions in a new light.
And I think that thinking about that question of duty is such a modern, postmodern question because, I think about my grandparents' generation. What they did as Jews was not entirely up to them. There was so much communal pressure and so many mores that dictated kind of how you were going to live and what you were going to do. Certainly before they made their way to Canada. My mom's parents grew up in a pretty awful place called Klimentov in Poland, which was bad for Jews and then got worse. So my Zadie and his brother Naftali left and brought as much of their family as was willing to come before the war, and the rest of them went up in smoke in Treblinka. But in thinking about sort of how they lived their lives, I don't think they would have thought so much that they had much of a choice. You kind of had to live this way. But the idea of modernity is that you get to choose, right? That there aren't these outer pressures or constrictions that tell me I have to do this, I have to do that. And in fact, if you take a look at, I think, most Jews in the North American context, even those who choose to live an Orthodox life, they're making a fundamental autonomous choice. I'm going to be in this community, not that community. I'm going to embrace this kind of a lifestyle, not that kind of a lifestyle. And we see that, I think, over and over again. And so Borowitz, I think, what was compelling to me was this idea of, yes, you have all this freedom, but you have duties. You have responsibilities. Those duties and responsibilities may not be imposed by force on the outside of you, but it darn well better well up from a place from within side of you. And so I think about that in terms of how do you get a Jew to feel that measure of inspiration? How do you help someone develop that sort of inspiration or spark inside where the flywheel catches and they don't do things because they have to, they do things because, they have to?
Right. What does it mean to choose to be commanded? It's a paradoxical concept, but it really does reflect our modern condition. And I quite agree with your analysis. I mean, you're channeling here the thought of somebody like Peter Berger, a kind of sociologist of modernity, who points out that even a person today under conditions of modernity, I'm not talking about somebody who's being held captive by a cult somewhere, but if you choose to live, say, a strictly Orthodox Jewish lifestyle, it's a choice you made. And actually, you could, if you've got access to a little bit of expendable income, you could 3 days from now be working as a volunteer in a paddy field in Thailand, or applying to be a catwalk model in Barcelona, or you could reinvent yourself. I don't want to exaggerate that. People are...
It's a good thing this isn't audio, because taking a look at me at this stage, I'm not walking the catwalk in Barcelona.
It's funny you say that, because I was staring right at you when that example came to my mind. So it's just how the mind works. But anyway, the point being, I did say you could apply for. I'm not saying I don't know how much work one would get. But the point being, we are fated, destined. Sometimes it's not always a blessing, but choice does seem to be one of the features of our modern lives. Of course, now in this postmodern world, you use that distinction, people have come back and questioned this idea, whether we have quite as much choice as we always thought we did, and whether we're not actually programmed by our genes and by our social norms and by the privileges we get because of the luck of how we get born and how much income we have access to. So one can argue this case. But yeah, think about Reform Judaism for a moment. Think about the great notion of informed choice, which many of us we grew up in one of those communities, we were told that this is how Reform Jews do stuff. We learn like crazy, we make an informed choice about how we're going to live our lives, and everything's wonderful. And I do in my book, and it's based on my observation of many years doing what I do, I wonder if that's actually true. I wonder whether people do have the motivation and the energy and the application and the capacity to study and then make informed choices. Abraham Joshua Heschel, a thinker who's been a great influence on my life, questioned that liberal notion. In one of his books, he says, actually, think about Jewish doing. We do more than we know, so that we can know more than we currently do. If you just wait, it's a bit like when you're choosing a life partner, okay? The notion of informed choices, you would get all the data, their credit score, their blood work, all of the stats. And then based on all of this, you're going to make a decision as to whether you are going to propose marriage to this person or not. Of course, that's not how it works. Until you jump in, until you make a commitment, you won't have a commitment. And so some of these ultra-modern versions of liberal Judaism, which have been the bulwark of much of Reform Judaism for a couple of centuries, need to be questioned. And then the issue is, well, how might we replace them? I'm not fantasizing about being an Orthodox Jew. That doesn't hold any great attraction for me. I'm looking for a way of being a liberal Jew in a new era, if you like.
And I think that being that model of what was supposed to be a liberal Jew, that you would make informed choice, is great on paper, right? But the fact is that most Jews in the non-Orthodox context don't have the opportunity, or certainly don't avail themselves of the opportunity, to build enough of a Jewish education to make informed choice.
Right.
So the choices that tend to get made are based not so much on informed choice, but they're based on inspiration. They're based on when the Spirit is moved. And I think that that's partly why I was so moved when I studied Heschel, because Heschel isn't about those logical, rational choices. It's all about pathos. It's all about what happens when the Spirit gets moved. What was it about Heschel that fascinated you, and how do you weave together sort of Borwitz's idea that, yes, there are duties that have to well up from within that we impose on ourselves because that's what it means to be Jewish. There are duties, there are commandments, we have a covenant. And at the same time, that part of the way that you, I think, ignite that engine is through this pathway of what I think Heschel might call radical amazement. But tell me how you weave together those two ideas.
Well, as a matter of fact, when I was studying in parallel to my rabbinical studies in Israel, I became fascinated by the thought of Heschel and decided to write first a doctorate about him and then publish a book about his work. And you're right, it's not the same. Even though we should point out biographically, Heschel was saved by the Hebrew Union College, came out to Cincinnati, taught at the Hebrew Union College for 5 years before going on to JTS, to the Jewish Theological Seminary, and had all kinds of connections and affinities. He also had studied previous to that at the Hochschule, the liberal seminary in Germany. He came from a deeply Hasidic background, but he was very well acquainted with the world of modernity, and I also want to say philosophy and rationalism and all the rest of it. He just didn't think that was enough. He didn't think that was wrong. He just didn't think it was enough. We're not going to get to where we need to get to if we think that life is a kind of equation or a crossword puzzle where you get the right answer and then you won and everything's okay. But actually, the big mysterious, ineffable, inexpressible, unsolvable questions of life don't fit that sort of simplistic matrix. And so I found myself very influenced. I was fascinated also by Heschel's profound learning. Heschel just knew just about everything. He had much of it committed to memory, and he didn't know it. He didn't use his knowledge as a stick to hit you with, but it informed. He wanted to say that many of the most profound insights. Heschel was politically quite a radical person. He was active, for example, in resistance to the Vietnam War when that was not a popular position to take, and he rooted his activism in his Judaism, in his deep learning. So I found that combination of learning, of engagement, of great rational faculties, but looking to something beyond a sort of banal rationalism, I found that to be extremely attractive.
So when you take those ideas and you sort of put them all together in a beautiful stew that becomes Michael Marmur, you have this really, I think, interesting mix of the rational and the, as you say, the mysterious, right? And this idea that Heschel sort of talks about, that radical amazement can lead to this sense of trying to understand what it is that the author of the universe feels, and to draw on that inspiration to determine what is your duty, what it is you're supposed to be and do in the world, I find very, very compelling. Because in your book, in the introduction, you talk about anxieties. Emmanuel Levinas, another thinker of the 20th century, writes that there are these three major anxieties that we confront. One is, as a Jewish people, will we survive? What's the future of Judaism? As I think Jonathan Sachs wrote in his book or his essay, will we have Jewish grandchildren? What is the future of Judaism? The second is, will the Jewish future, after we enter the land of Israel and build the state of Israel, A, be recognizable, and B, be desirable? And then the third is the moral price of sovereignty too high? And I think about that because of all of the anxieties I think we're feeling in our world today. There's erosions of democracy here and in Israel. There's this rapid explosion in the virus of anti-Semitism. There are these ever-widening chasms of division, hatred, and violence that you see all over the world, but certainly in American society, you're seeing it in Israeli society. And so when you think about how Judaism answers these anxieties, as you say in your analogy to the bear hunt, how do you go through them?
The Levinas that I cite in my book and that you just mentioned is one of his fantastic Talmudic dialogues, which is a kind of a riff on this biblical story of the spies. And he asks the questions. If you recall, the 12 spies go in, and then there are two goodies, Joshua and Caleb, who come back and say, it's all great, let's carry on. And he asks the question, what was the anxiety of the 10 others, the majority of spies? He says it's just it's too simplistic to say, well, they were wrong or they were finks or something. So what is it they saw? And he puts into their tongues, if it puts into their mouths these words, and he is of course channeling, I think, his own contemporary anxieties. He is we don't need to rehearse them again, but these are big existential questions. I write in my book that it is written as I claim most Jewish theology is written, out of a combination of anxiety and hope. And before I even try to ask the question, what are the answers to these anxieties, I try to face up to them. I try to give them a name. Too often they are unstated. I cite the example of Saxe's book, Will We Have Jewish Grandchildren? Because what he does there is he puts his finger right on the anxiety of many of the people who are reading him and thinking about him. And rather than dance around it, he just heat-seeking missile, he goes straight to that anxiety. I mention in my book two overwhelming anxieties, which, again, you would need a lot of time just to sort of recover from thinking about. One of them we've been discussing over these last few minutes, which is the project of modern liberal Judaism. The anxiety that keeps me up at night is not, is it defensible? Can you make an argument for it? Because I know you can. I've made many of them. The question is rather, has it got legs? Will it prevail? Is there enough within this notion of liberal reform, modern Judaism, that will so engage the coming generations, it will really grow and flourish? What's its future? And the other big anxiety, apart from all the obvious environment and the world going to hell in a handbasket and all of those general anxieties, here are some specific ones. I do think, as an Israeli, about the project of Israel and wonder whether this notion of trying to be a Jewish and a democratic state, how are we doing on that? And what are the chances of us prevailing? And here again, I think about my kids and the coming generations and wonder how it's all going to work out. I do think that you're better off in the end facing up to these anxieties. Usually we don't like to do it very much. And when somebody goes on about them too much, they're being, a downer, and you want to think positive thoughts. I do say that an essential corollary to the anxiety is the hope. Hope is not the same as optimism. It's not believing that if you whistle a happy tune, everything's just going to work out fine. But it is crucial to any, not only Jewish thought, to any version of Judaism I can think of, a belief that somehow by our actions and by things beyond our own actions, we can see our way to a different tomorrow. That's absolutely crucial. So I write this book in a combination of anxiety and hope, and I think that's the right place to be.
I think about hope because I recently read Elisha Rabbi's memoir about his time as a hostage underneath Gaza in the tunnels and what those almost 500 days did to him and how he responded to that extraordinary challenge. And he writes a lot about how hope, even in the darkness of that time and place, was what allowed him to continue to push through to another day and ultimately to realize his release. And I appreciate how hope is a good answer to anxiety. But there's also, I think, this idea that hope may also not be enough, right? That there has to be some marriage between the thoughts and the way in which one chooses to live, right? So, Heschel writes in his work on the prophets about how the prophets feel so deeply what they believe is what the divine pathos, what God is feeling, that it spurs them to live in a particular way, to act, to try to make a difference, to rage against the machine, or however you might inform it. And I think we sort of ask ourselves the same question that Levin asked and that you ask, which is, as you look at where Israel is, which you describe as the most consequential event in over a millennium, which I think it is, are we up to those challenges? Are we up to the challenges that are presented by our many implacable enemies from the outside and all of the challenges that we face from our divides in the inside?
So I don't want to give away the spoiler of the book and tell you whether we are or are not up to it. And of course, less flippantly, I don't know. None of us knows if we are. I do want to come back for a moment and say a word in defense of hope. You mentioned Elisha Rabbi. I'll mention another person whose life was indelibly changed by the events of the 7th of October, Maoz Yinon. Maoz Yinon lost both of his parents on that day. And he writes, I cite him in the book, he writes about hope and says, it's wrong to think about hope as something you have. Do you have hope? That's not how it works. Hope is something you do. And so the most significant and resonant versions of hope are not just, I have an idea in my mind or a hope in my heart, but rather I have a plan of action. I'm doing stuff. And we may disagree. People are allowed to disagree about what are the things we ought to be doing. I myself am very involved in an organization in Israel called Rabbis for Human Rights. And we go out and do things. I'm speaking to you at the end of a difficult week in our organization because a colleague of mine, Rabbi Dana Sharon, found herself hit by a drone run by settlers from a Jewish settlement. We go out during the olive picking season and try to provide a kind of protective presence for Palestinians who are trying to pick their olives and carry on with their lives. And increasingly, folks who live, it's not everyone, but some people who live within these Jewish settlements in what would known in Israel as Judea and Samaria, come down and try to do anything they can to discourage or intimidate. And this week, things were ratcheted up to a new level, where not only was she hit by this drone, she got a few stitches and she's okay, but then a couple of these folks, these young boys, dressed in sort of a version of army fatigues, came down, pointed their guns at our people, fired in the air. It's pretty scary out there. Now, again, I use this as an example, not to tell you who was in the right and who's in the wrong, but I'm saying that if you take hope seriously, you sometimes have to take some risks for hope, and you have to be prepared to step outside of your comfort zone to promote your understanding or your vision of what needs to happen. Israeli society, which is in a very challenging place at the moment, for sure. One thing I will say about the last couple of years, and before that, even during the great campaign on issues of judicial reform, which is still ongoing, it's been remarkable to see, even whilst many of the government and state institutions have not really shown up, done particularly well, society, people organizing and mobilizing, whether it's, soup kitchens or there's any number, there's 1,000 different ways that one can do this. But they are, in my version of this, or in Mos Yinon's, they are doing hope. They're not thinking hopeful thoughts, but they're mobilizing and going out and doing something. Can Israel prevail through all of this? I'm reminded of the fantastic essay, which I also cite in my book, by Shimon Ravidovich, describing the Jews as the ever-dying people. We are constantly convinced, and maybe one of the secrets to our longevity is that in every generation, Jews have been convinced that that's it, it's over, we're done for. The issue is whether one can convert that anxiety into something more positive and more programmatic. So I don't know if we can prevail, but I know that conversations like this may help us prevail.
One of my teachers and mentors, Michael Brooks, who for many years led the Hillel organization at the University of Michigan, once told me this great story where for about a year, he would open every board meeting with a motion to disband the organization. And his thought was, if you can't come up with enough good arguments to defeat the resolution, you should probably pass it. I don't have enough guts to try that at Temple Bethel, but I think about that because one of the things that I think has inspired me so much in the aftermath of October 7th, and I think also in the year before that, is how certain deeply held convictions about love for the state and a vision for the state and what the ideal of that state should be has spurred thousands and thousands of people into the street on an almost weekly basis. And that sense of inspiration that impels one to act is one that I think we need to do a better job of figuring out how to cultivate. And I think that part of what the reform movement has not done a good enough job at is to help the people who subscribe to liberal Judaism think really deeply about who you are and why you choose the convictions that you choose. Our movement has done a remarkable job at helping us realize a mission or a vision or agenda of social justice. But I'm not sure that we've done enough work on helping us realize the incredible storehouse of Jewish wisdom around spiritual practice, around all of the things that can nurture a Jew from the inside to cultivate awareness and gratitude and spiritual wholeness and a sense of transcendence, which would then, hopefully, from having created a very, very strong spirit and a strong relationship with God, to be able to then channel all of that into righteous living in a holy society. Do you see, in all of the work that you've done in helping to train future rabbis, the kind of secret sauce that we need as a movement to try to create a Judaism of hope and that will create sufficient inspiration for a future that will lead us towards that better end?
One way of answering your great question is to refer to a distinction I make in the introduction to my book, in which I, somewhat surprisingly perhaps, reached to the breakfast table for understanding different kinds of Jewish thought. The distinction comes from the world of peanut butter. And I try to suggest that there are smooth and crunchy or chunky ways of putting together one's Jewish ideas. I think that this project of liberal Judaism, Reform Judaism we've been talking about, was characterized for many in its smooth form. Here are the beautifully integrated answers to the big questions. They spread easy and evenly. They cover all aspects and all problems. And if you just spread it on, then you'll be fine. And for me, at least, that approach has become impossible. I think in the difficult situations we live in, a more chunky approach is called for. What does that mean? There are chunks of Jewish texts and Jewish sources that one needs to be prepared to roll up one's sleeves and to dive into. There are ideas that may not sit so brilliantly, consistently one with the other, and one doesn't need to be over worried about that. We should always interrogate ourselves and try to see that there is a fundamental coherence to our ideas. But I think that becoming overly platitudinous, just saying, I could repeat to you now some of the things we've been saying to each other. We're all partners in the world of work of creation, and we have to do tikkun olam. I believe all of those things. But I'm saying unless and until we give them crunchy expressions, until we work out what that actually looks like, ritually, socially, communally, ideologically, until we do that, it's just a bit too bland. So I've noticed, you asked me about my many years of teaching generations of students, which has been my greatest privilege. I continue to be blown away by the high motivation and in many cases the serious talent and capacity that people are still throwing themselves into this work and still committing themselves to lives of Jewish service in clergy and in other roles. I'm still encouraged by that. And I would say, the crunchier, the better.
And I appreciate how your work and your scholarship, what you write, how you teach, has led to a thickening, I think, of what is the understanding of Jewish life. And God willing, we'll all feel a sense of inspiration to make our lives a little crunchier. Not so much in the granola sense, but in the peanut butter sense. But that will live thicker lives, that have more intention and richer understandings and greater wisdom. Michael, thank you for this great conversation.
Thank you so much.
The Essential Questions podcast has been made possible by the Temple Beth El Jewish Ideas Incubator, committed to creativity and innovation in modern Jewish life. Many thanks to our production team. You can find this podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, and the Podbean app, as well as on Temple Beth El's website, tveboca.org/essential questions. Share this podcast with your friends. Rate us on Apple Podcast or Spotify to spread the word. And we want to know, what are your essential questions? Let us know by emailing us at eq@tveboca.org. I'm Rabbi Dan Levin, and thanks for listening to the Essential Questions podcast.